Hi, my name is Sarah. I am a minority rights activist and an Egyptian. And for the past 3 years, being an Egyptian has meant for me reclaiming my belonging to this nation. This is because for the past 3 years in Egypt, I have been part of a collective effort to formulate who we are, but more importantly, what we want. This is new because for the past 30 years in Egypt, we have been told by our regime that what we will do is connected to who we are as individuals and not what we want as people. So for the past 20 years, I've been planning my future independently from the fate of my own people. And I ended up leaving Cairo for Paris on the 17th of January 2011 to pursue my education. On the 18th of January, I met this German journalist, Camille, in a bar in Paris, and she was doing work on the uprisings in Tunisia. And after a few drinks, she inevitably asked me, "So, what do you think will happen now that Ben Ali's regime is down?" And I told her, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, don't you think Egyptians will have their own revolution?" And I smiled at her sarcastically, and I said, "Well, of course not." Obviously, she was right and I was wrong because the revolution went ahead and took place on the 25th of January 2011. And I just couldn't believe I left Egypt a week before the revolution, and now I had to sit back and watch it from so far away. So I developed a love-hate relationship with this revolution. I loved it because for the first time in my life, I could envision an Egypt that I wished for and could be part of. In fact, the idea was that anyone could be part of this new Egypt. I hated it because its very existence reminded me that I had lived for the past 20 years completely disconnected from my own people. In June 2011, I went back to Egypt, and I decided I will have random conversations with friends and family to make up my mind about this revolution. At this time, Egypt was already questioning the path it had taken to democracy. And I soon discovered that many of us shared this bittersweet relationship with the revolution. Ahmed Amir, who is a blind journalist I met on the course of a minority rights training I was organizing in Egypt, is a good example of that. Ahmed might be blind, but it honestly took me 5 minutes on a noisy bus ride in Cairo to discover that he sees Egypt much more clearly than I do. And if you ask Ahmed about his story with the revolution, he will tell you two things. He will tell you that 3 years before the revolution, he met his assigned officer from the Ministry of Interior. This officer was responsible for monitoring his anti-regime writings and would come and pick him up regularly in the middle of the night from his bed so he could spend the night in prison for his writings. Then Ahmed will amazingly fast forward to the 28th of January 2011, a day that Egyptians call the Day of Anger, where he will tell you that he saw all colors of Egypt at Tahrir Square. And he will tell you that it is at this day that he realized that there will be freedom in Egypt. See, before January 2011, there was no freedom in Egypt. And ironically, the best way to describe it is to say that Egypt was a pyramid. And depending on your class, education, gender, ethnicity, religion, you would be somewhere in this pyramid. In a way, we were all stuck in these categories that defined who we are and where we are in the structure. And there was no way to change that. It went on for so long because it allowed everyone to exclude at least someone. The rich excluded the poor, the men excluded the women, the Muslim excluded the non-Muslims. And if you ask Egyptians about how to call this type of regimes, they will tell you two things. Either they will tell you it's not a dictatorial regime, it's not an authoritarian regime, it's not a military regime. They will refuse all the above categories that we usually use. Or they will tell you that they can't agree on how to call it. But one thing they will tell you is that they all felt excluded, and that is no matter where they were in the structure. So no wonder that the only chant everyone agrees on about the revolution is the Egyptians want the end of the regime. Unfortunately, the end of the Mubarak regime in February 2011 did not mean the end of the exclusion regime. In fact, in February 2011, the military took over. And while they were announcing presidential and parliamentary elections, a lot of street movements like trade unions and youth unions went on demonstrations and became violent around November 2011. And for a lot of people who had lived disconnected from the political life, like myself, this was a double struggle. This was a struggle for political participation, but it was also a struggle against our own little governments, our mothers. Because we were prohibited from going, my mom is in the public. We were prohibited from going to these demonstrations. So myself and a few friends decided that we will take the bus to university, and then we would agree with a bus driver from university to take us to Tahrir Square, and then take us back home. So we would go there, scream from the top of our lungs, and then go home like nothing happened. And as a journalist once put it back then, Egypt is the only country where youth are more afraid of their parents than they are afraid of tanks. After a long fight, we eventually got to elect our first civilian president in June 2012. The losers of the old regime had become the winners of the new regime. Everything was wonderful, until on the 22nd of November 2012, I got this phone call from a friend of mine, Manar, who's a journalist, about my same age. And I was driving my little black car in the crazy streets of Cairo, and she said, "Where are you?" And I told her, "Well, I'm coming to meet you." She said, "Well, pull over." So I pulled over, and she said, "President Morsi just announced a constitutional decree protecting his decisions from all accountability." And I sat in silence in my car, choking in my deepest, darkest fears. I felt betrayed, and I felt angry because this was a déjà vu, and that the question of how we got there was just running again in my head. And I drove to my friends, and as we sat talking and talking, our anger transformed into hatred against the Islamists, and it hit me. I realized that the biggest crime that had been committed against Egyptians for the past 30 years is that the exclusion regime was so embedded in our very ideas, in our very souls, in our very being, that we didn't even know about it. We didn't even know about it until we hit rock bottom. And that rock bottom was when our first elected president had just excluded us from decision-making. You know, the more I think about it, the more I tell myself that the January Revolution and the June movement and all the coming revolutions are unescapable. This is because, simply, exclusion regimes bear the seeds of their own destruction. With time and resistance, they become violent. And I'm not only talking about the kind of violence that Ahmed Amer had to handle. I am talking about all the other kinds of violence that are so subtle and that end up marginalizing everyone. A lot of people ask us why we went down on November and why we went down against Morsi in June. And my answer is that because the question is not about elections, it's not about the parliamentary system, it's about if we can build a system where we can all find a place and realize our full potential. And no, we were not afraid of dying because we don't want to live in a country where we have to trade our freedom and right for a piece of bread so that we can't hold our governments accountable for any other types of exclusion that we have to handle every day. A lot of people ask me why I work on minority rights in Egypt, why I don't work on education or raising awareness to help democracy strive. And my answer is that because I believe democracy starts at the margins. It's only when a society looks inside itself and realizes the exclusion regimes it's producing by its own self that it can truly become democratic. Today, the question in Egypt, and I believe everywhere, is how can we talk about equality if we're not talking about discrimination? How can we talk about justice if we can't talk about the violence that's being done to us, but more importantly, the violence that we are doing to each other? If I have learned one thing for the past 3 years of revolution in Egypt, is that democracy is about dialogue, and not the pretty, sugar-coated dialogue that we hear in the media about all the things we are doing right. I am talking about the blunt, honest, and painful dialogue that we have to have with each other about all the things we are doing wrong. Today, Egyptians have created the first electronic map for sexual harassment. They have engaged in monologues to tell each other about the experiences of violence they are living. They have done things like this and this, where they will paint a wall that was made to prohibit them from protesting into their own vision of what it should be and their own vision of the future. And this is why today, if you ask me right outside this hall if I believe that the Egyptian revolution will succeed, I will smile at you, and this time honestly, and tell you, of course, yes. Thank you.